What detonated in Minnesota is not merely the largest case of welfare fraud in American history. It is a structural crisis exposing a profound failure of governance and trust.
The profound failure, yes.
For the first time in modern U.S. history, over 480 state employees, not political operatives, not anonymous sources, but actual career professionals inside the government, have publicly accused their own sitting leadership of actively hiding, enabling, and protecting a fraud scheme that has now ballooned far beyond initial reports.
And that number, 480, it's almost impossible to comprehend in this context.
This catastrophic betrayal, which began with stolen child nutrition funds, has stretched its tentacles internationally, routing massive sums through opaque financial corridors, with federal investigators now quietly analyzing possible intersections with terror finance networks. The question that cuts to the core of this failure is this. When the system designed to protect the vulnerable became an unchecked cash pipeline, and when leadership fought harder to silence its own whistleblowers than the criminals, what does that say about the integrity of the state? Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on News Focus Podcast. And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it.
That urgency in your voice is, I think, entirely appropriate. What we are discussing today is a systematic collapse, and the source material doesn't really allow for simple conclusions of, just an oversight failure.
It's way beyond that.
Far beyond that.
Yeah.
Gravity of the situation is reflected in that internal revolt you mentioned. We are looking at a public mutiny of nearly 500 state insiders who claim they were essentially fighting their own government to expose criminal activity.
Their own bosses.
Their own bosses, their own leadership. And this forces us to move beyond negligence and seriously evaluate the allegations of, calculation and intent.
Okay, let's unpack the sheer scale and the psychological impact of this internal revolt. It's a staggering number.
It is.
When we say over 480 employees from the Governor's Department of Human Services, the DHS, stood up, we need to understand the context here.
Yes, the context is everything.
The DHS is the engine room of Minnesota's social programs. It manages billions and billions of dollars. So for nearly 500 professional career staffers, these aren't political appointees.
No, these are people who do the work day in and day out.
Exactly. For them to risk their livelihoods by making a public statement against their commander-in-chief is what the sources are describing as a political nuclear event.
And that's not hyperbole. That volume is the key.
Yeah.
Because it structurally changes the entire narrative. In politics, one or two whistleblowers can be and often are dismissed.
As disgruntled employees.
Disgruntled employees, or they have a political axe to grind. But 480, that represents a critical mass. It's a significant portion of the internal operational apparatus of that department.
It's a whole division, basically.
It's more than that in some cases. It signals that the internal mechanism for self-correction was not only broken, but allegedly weaponized against anyone who was trying to use it.
Weaponized? That's a strong word.
It is, but it fits the allegations.
And the nature of their accusation is extremely specific and, frankly, damning. They didn't just say, hey, we found fraud.
No, it was much more pointed.
They alleged the governor didn't just passively ignore the fraud, which would be incompetence, but that he allegedly built the environment that allowed it, shielded the people doing it, and crucially, retaliated against anyone who tried to expose it.
And that's the vital distinction right there. That's what elevates this from a typical scandal to a genuine crisis of integrity.
A crisis of the entire system.
Yes. The core claim is that they were revolting against what they called an entire fraud architecture.
A fraud architecture.
Yes, an architecture that was consciously operating under the governor's watch. So when the whistleblower statement hit the national stage, generating tens of millions of views, it immediately sparked these questions about whether this was just a failure of management or if it was a deliberate structural choice.
Let's delve deeper into that phrase because it sounds like something out of a spy novel. What do they actually mean by a fraud architecture in government terms?
Well, it's less cloak and dagger and more bureaucratic rot. They are describing a layered system where the normal checks and balances, the very rules designed to prevent theft, were not just accidentally neglected, but allegedly dismantled.
Systematically bypassed.
Systematically bypassed or ignored to facilitate the continuous flow of funds to certain groups.
Yeah.
The architecture, as they describe it, consists of three alleged elements. First, you have the regulatory collapse that allowed the money to flow freely in the first place.
Okay, the floodgates opened.
Exactly. Second, the active suppression of internal investigations. So when someone did notice the flood, Their attempts to shut it off were blocked.
So you're punished for doing your job.
That's the allegation. And third, the protection of the specific individuals and organizations who were benefiting from all this fraud. So it's a three-layered shield.
The implication then, based on the sheer volume of these accusers, is that the system wasn't malfunctioning at all. It was allegedly performing exactly as leadership wanted it to perform, which was to maximize certain outcomes. In this case, they allege political cohesion at the expense of, well, basic fiscal oversight.
Precisely. For you, the listener, to understand the gravity of this, just imagine for a second you're a mid-level investigator inside the DHS.
Right.
You're watching hundreds of millions of dollars just disappear out the door. You're filing detailed reports, you're flagging suspicious activity, and then you see the very people you reported on continue to operate, continue to receive funds, while your own career is suddenly put in jeopardy.
You become the problem.
You become the problem. The whistleblowers' sentiment is crystal clear. They felt they were fighting an enemy within their own department, and they felt the only way to protect the taxpayer was to break ranks and go public.
Which is an incredible risk.
A monumental risk. And this is why the volume, that 480 number, matters so much. It makes the allegation of systemic calculation, rather than just isolated error, extremely difficult to dismiss. They are risking everything because they perceive the internal danger of this protecting corruption as greater than the external risk of going public.
So the mutiny, this political nuclear event, it really serves as Exhibit A that this was, in their view, an intentional shielding environment, not just a series of unfortunate mistakes.
Correct. When nearly 500 people independently describe what they call a coordinated retaliation network, it implies not just passive indifference from the top.
Yeah.
It implies active resource allocation, time, energy, political capital, all being used toward burying the truth. This moves the entire conversation firmly into the territory of alleged abuse of power.
And that structural failure we just discussed, this architecture, it didn't facilitate petty larceny. This wasn't someone stealing office supplies.
No, not even close.
It allowed for what is accurately described as industrial-scale looting. Let's start with the entry point that first captured national attention: the Feeding Our Future scheme.
Right, this is the baseline from which the whole crisis just exploded. The Feeding Our Future scandal involved the theft of over $250 million.
$250 million.
$250 million just from federal child nutrition programs. And this was primarily done by utilizing emergency waivers that were granted during the COVID-19 pandemic. And even that initial amount was already considered one of the largest single fraud cases in U.S. history.
And the mechanics of that initial fraud were, alarming in their simplicity. This wasn't some complex cryptocurrency scheme.
No, it was stunningly simple. It was high-volume, low-effort fraud that was enabled by the complete relaxation of standards. The scheme really relied on establishing fake meal sites, shell restaurants, and manipulating nonprofit frameworks.
So how did it work, practically?
They would claim they were serving tens of thousands of meals daily, and they would use physical locations, like a small apartment or a totally abandoned storefront, that couldn't possibly support that kind of volume.
Right, there's no way you're serving 10,000 meals out of a one-bedroom apartment.
Of course not. But because the in-person site checks were waived, and all the paperwork standards collapsed due to the emergency context of the pandemic, these fake claims were they were rubber-stamped.
Pushed right through the system.
Which allowed them to funnel massive federal reimbursements directly into their networks, month after month.
But as federal prosecutors and state auditors began to dig in and synthesize all the data, the financial toll exploded far beyond that initial $250 million. What are the updated figures telling us now?
Well, the current confirmed estimate from federal investigators now exceeds $1 billion.
$1 billion. With a B.
$1 billion, stolen across multiple Minnesota welfare and social service programs. So it wasn't limited just to child nutrition.
So the same model was being used elsewhere.
It seems so. This indicates that the fraud architecture the whistleblowers described was modular. It could be applied to various streams of federal funding that were pouring into the state during the pandemic.
And here's where the information provided by the insiders gets truly critical, and frankly, a lot darker.
Yes.
The whistleblowers themselves are claiming that the final number could reach an unimaginable $10 billion that has vanished through these coordinated networks. We have to address that massive figure. Why is their internal estimate so much higher than the federal confirmed number?
That figure, $10 billion, it demands very careful scrutiny.
Of course.
It's important to clarify that this is an allegation or a high-end internal estimate. It's likely projecting the total vulnerability and related fraud that occurred across the entire DHS portfolio.
So everything.
Everything, including areas like Medicaid, housing assistance, and other child care services, all of which operated under similarly collapsed oversight during that same period. So while the $1 billion figure represents charges related to specific known schemes,
The ones they can prove in court right now.
exactly, the $10 billion figure suggests the total leakage and systemic vulnerability that these insiders fear. It characterizes the state as having undergone an entire period of industrial-scale looting, not just one massive isolated theft.
Which implies the failure wasn't localized to one program, but was endemic to the state's entire approach to handling that federal influx during the crisis.
That's the core of it.
So what were the specific enabling factors that allowed Minnesota to become what's been called a fraud magnet?
The key factor was the intentional relaxation of regulatory control. During the COVID period, the federal government, and by extension the state DHS, moved toward emergency waivers and self-certification. The goal was to speed aid delivery.
Which is understandable in a crisis.
It is understandable, but it came at a cost.
Right.
It meant that processes like physical site verification, which is absolutely essential to prove a nonprofit, is actually feeding children, practically evaporated.
Can you give us a specific regulatory example? What exactly was waived or relaxed that opened this door?
Sure. Prior to the waivers, strict paperwork standards and mandatory, in-person site checks were required before any nonprofit could be approved to distribute meals and claim reimbursement.
The common sense stuff.
The basic guardrails. Under the emergency system, nonprofits could be approved with almost zero verification, often just relying on self-reported data. The sources we've seen highlight that state-level audits were often waived or heavily delayed, which removed the necessary deterrent.
So there was no fear of getting caught.
Very little. This gave fraudsters a green light. They knew they could submit fake meal counts for months or even years before anyone would physically verify their operation.
And this regulatory collapse led to what prosecutors themselves called systemic dereliction. And nothing illustrates that failure better than the example of one of the key defendants, a man named Usman Chamra.
Yes, Chamra's involvement is incredibly damning because it demonstrates the state's failure to apply lessons learned or even to cross-reference their own basic databases. This is a person who was previously kicked out of the federal SNAP food stamp program back in 2015.
So years earlier.
Years earlier, due to suspected fraud. He was a known bad actor with a documented history of exploiting these very welfare systems.
Yet, instead of being flagged and rejected, he was allegedly welcomed back into the new, rapidly expanding child nutrition program under the current administration.
Where prosecutors claim he stole even more money.
How is that even possible? How can a previously sanctioned individual just re-enter a similar scheme?
Well, it speaks directly to the complete dysfunction of the internal controls. His prior sanction should have been an immediate red flag that just blocked his application cold.
It should have been automatic.
It should have been. The fact that he was allegedly able to exploit this new, self-certified nonprofit framework suggests the regulatory vacuum was so complete that the vetting process was simply non-existent.
They just weren't looking.
Or they weren't allowed to look. Prosecutors are arguing that the DHS failed to link two fundamental anti-fraud databases, one covering SMP and one covering child nutrition. That basic failure allowed him to just cycle back into the system unimpeded.
So the systemic failure was twofold. Relaxing the rules externally, and then failing to maintain even basic cross-checking mechanisms internally.
Absolutely. The environment created was not one where criminals had to fight the system to get the money. It was one where the system allegedly provided them with the roadmap for the crime.
We've established this industrial scale of looting, but now we have to follow the money trail. We need to see where those billions actually ended up, which leads us directly into some very serious international security concerns.
Yes.
This is where the scandal shifts from domestic corruption to potentially global money laundering.
And this international dimension transforms the risk profile of this entire situation. It's a game changer. The sources allege that massive sums, we're talking tens of millions of dollars at a time, were being converted to cash and routed overseas.
And much of it to one specific country.
Much of it flowing directly into Somalia. This is the stage where a criminal theft meets a potential national security vulnerability.
Tracking this movement is incredibly complicated because the money wasn't routed through conventional banking systems, right? It wasn't just a simple wire transfer.
No, not at all.
Can you break down the mechanisms they allegedly used? Specifically, what are these Hawala-style transfer networks?
Certainly. Hawala, or sometimes spelled Hala, it's an informal value transfer system. You might see it referred to as an IVTS, or more simply, money transfer operators, MTOs.
And how does it work?
It operates completely outside traditional Western banking regulations like SWIFT. So instead of wire transfers, the system relies on a network of brokers, or hawaladars. These brokers operate based on trust and a ledger system. A person gives cash to a broker in, say, Minneapolis,
Right.
and the corresponding broker in Mogadishu releases an equivalent amount of cash to the recipient, often just for a small commission.
So the money itself doesn't technically move across borders through a regulated bank.
That is the critical point. The actual bulk cash might move much later, or it might be offset by other transactions going in the opposite direction. But the immediate transfer is done without a paper trail that connects the sender and the recipient in a way that is easily traceable by financial regulators.
And that's the appeal for illicit activities.
It's why Hawala is heavily utilized in regions that lack traditional banking infrastructure, but it's also why it has historically been flagged by the U.S. Treasury Department as a mechanism that is very prone to money laundering and terror finance.
City Journal reports specifically labeled Minnesota a cash pipeline to Somalia. I mean, the betrayal of the original intent money meant for hungry children in Minneapolis is compounded by the sheer difficulty federal authorities now face in tracing those specific funds once they hit that Hawala corridor.
The difficulty lies in the opacity, the lack of transparency. When tens of millions of taxpayer dollars are funneled through these opaque channels, the state and the federal government lose control entirely. They lose visibility.
And the concern just escalates from there.
It escalates significantly when we link this to the national security context.
And that is the dark implication that has federal investigators so deeply involved. The suggestion that a portion of these stolen funds may have traveled through financial channels that are historically used by extremist groups.
And we have to be extremely clear here.
Yes.
The sources are not claiming that the Minnesota state leadership intentionally funded terror. That is not the allegation. The allegation is that the failures and the alleged negligence of the administration in allowing this pipeline to flourish created a national security vulnerability that bad actors could, and allegedly did, exploit.
And the specific terrorist organization repeatedly cited in these reports is Al-Shabaab.
Yes, the powerful Somali-based group responsible for, horrific attacks across East Africa.
So what is the connection between this Hawala corridor that you described and a group like Al-Shabaab?
Well, City Journal reports and other intelligence analyses have long warned that the same informal value transfer corridors that are utilized to move stolen welfare dollars from the U.S. to Somalia are also routinely used by organized crime and by groups tied to militant networks like Al-Shabaab.
They're using the same highway, basically.
It's the same financial highway. Because the money transfer operates outside the regulatory gaze of U.S. banks, it is functionally impossible to distinguish between a legitimate family remittance, stolen welfare funds, or terror finance once that cash enters the system. It all gets mixed together.
And the source material notes that Treasury officials under the previous administration were already reviewing whether Minnesota-linked transfers were intersecting with known terror finance red flags.
Exactly. This indicates the federal government was already highly suspicious of the financial dynamics in that region.
So this isn't a new theory.
This is not a new theory manufactured after the scandal broke. It was an existing, recognized national security risk. The state's alleged failure to shut down this massive leak essentially worsened an already recognized financial blind spot for the U.S. government.
So by allowing the state to become an easy channel for funneling bulk cash overseas through these opaque systems, the administration, regardless of their intent, allegedly created a pathway that compromised the U.S. government's ability to track dangerous financial flows globally.
The moment you realize taxpayer money intended for domestic programs might be traveling through the very same financial conduits used by groups like Al-Shabaab, the entire state-level failure becomes a matter of grave national security concern.
Overnight.
Instantly. It demands an all-hands-on-deck response from Treasury and the FBI, which is exactly what we are now seeing. It just speaks to the enormous consequences of regulatory collapse. It doesn't just mean money is stolen. It means national security protocols are fundamentally breached.
Okay, so given this industrial scale of looting and these massive international risks, the next critical element of this deep dive is understanding why. If internal investigators knew about this early on, why did the leadership allegedly fight so hard to stop its own employees from exposing the truth?
Right.
This moves us squarely into the allegations of a cover-up and the abuse of power.
And this section is where we really have to analyze the motive behind the alleged inaction. We have the specific detailed claims from those 480-plus DHS workers regarding the retaliation they faced. If the scale of the fraud was unimaginable, the severity of the alleged retaliation is, frankly, equally shocking.
Let's detail the claims of this coordinated retaliation network they described. What did the whistleblowers say happened to them when they tried to raise the alarm inside the system?
Their accounts, taken together, paint a terrifying picture of internal abuse of power. They allege that reports documenting the fraud were not simply shelved or ignored. They were actively destroyed or buried to manipulate the evidentiary trail. Internal investigators who pushed for subpoenas or arrests were allegedly sidelined. They were reassigned to irrelevant duties, or in some cases, outright fired.
So they were neutralized professionally.
Completely. Furthermore, whistleblowers claim their careers were explicitly threatened, creating this hostile environment that was clearly designed to enforce silence across the department.
And some of the allegations were even more extreme than that, including claims that employees were monitored and that their families were targeted with intimidation tactics.
Yes, and those extreme allegations really speak to the level of fear that was operating within the DHS. If these claims are true, it suggests that the machinery of the state government was allegedly turned against its own employees.
Using its power to intimidate its own people.
That's the allegation. The conclusion drawn by the workers themselves is that this was not a decentralized random occurrence. This was a coordinated retaliation network designed to protect the very fraud rings they were trying to expose.
That structural choice to protect the perpetrators over the truth tellers leads directly to the core question of motive. Why? Why would an administration allegedly allow billions to leak away and then actively punish people who were trying to stop it?
This is where we have to apply a very impartial analysis to the alleged political calculation.
Okay.
The sources we have indicate that internal investigators allegedly warned the governor and his team about the escalating fraud years before it became national news. These warnings were detailed, they were documented, and they were repeated. Yet the inaction persisted.
And the alleged motivation for this deliberate inaction, according to officials cited from inside the Attorney General's office, relates to political sensitivity.
The specific political calculation alleged is that the governor feared that aggressively cracking down on nonprofit groups tied to Minnesota's large and vital Somali community would risk alienating a core Democratic voting bloc. Many of the groups implicated in the Feeding Our Future fraud and the related schemes had deep ties to this community.
So the political calculus was allegedly, if we stop the fraud, we risk a devastating political backlash. We could lose support from a key demographic or, worse, face accusations of ethnic targeting.
Exactly. And this is what transforms the scandal from mere mismanagement into an intentional political shielding of fraudulent networks.
That's the accusation.
That's the accusation. The sources suggest a complex weighing of priorities was happening. Maintaining political cohesion, avoiding a controversial public fight, and preserving community trust was allegedly prioritized over enforcing strict financial oversight and recovering taxpayer dollars. The administration allegedly sought to avoid controversy above all else.
So investigations were delayed, audits were ignored, warning signs were dismissed, not out of laziness, but because there was a calculated political fear of the fallout that a serious crackdown would create.
And that alleged fear of political backlash, the concern about preserving a coalition, created the perfect window of opportunity for the fraudsters. They recognized that the leadership was allegedly unwilling to apply the necessary pressure to stop these schemes because of the political optics.
They saw the weakness.
They saw it and exploited it. When internal staff pushed too hard, they were shut down because they were threatening the political strategy of delay and avoidance. The internal staff asserts that they are faced with a terrible choice. Risk your career to tell the truth, or stay silent and enable corruption for the sake of political expediency.
And the claim is that this mismanagement then escalated into a calculated political compromise with criminal activity, which fundamentally undermined the integrity of the state's financial controls.
And that's the most damaging potential legacy of this entire scandal. The accusation that hundreds of millions, possibly billions of dollars were lost because the political cost of stopping the fraud was allegedly deemed too high.
The whistleblower mutiny was the turning point. It's what made this scandal too big for the state to contain. The pressure on state leadership became unbearable, and that led to intense national scrutiny, including the governor's appearance on national television.
Yes, and the optics during that confrontation, specifically on Meet the Press, were, well, they were devastating for the administration. The governor was forced to defend his actions regarding the largest welfare fraud case in U.S. history on the national stage.
And everyone was watching.
Everyone was watching. Political observers were looking for signs of accountability, of decisive leadership.
Instead, many observers felt he delivered what was described as an incoherent pivot. He really failed to offer a meaningful apology for the systemic failures or take direct responsibility for the alleged negligence his own employees were highlighting.
His defense relied heavily on deflection. I mean, he blamed national politics, he blamed cuts to Inspector General funding.
Which is a common refrain.
A very common refrain, though whether those cuts predated his administration is a crucial point of analysis. And then he offered the highly unusual excuse that Minnesota's prosperity somehow made it a unique magnet for fraudsters.
I remember that line.
That claim went viral because it seemed to completely sidestep the core issue, which was the documented collapse of his own state's internal controls.
And the most quoted line from that interview, where he claimed he takes responsibility for putting people in jail, that was widely broadcast as a sign of a leader unable to grasp the central allegations.
Right.
The problem wasn't just the crime, it was the accusation of the cover-up and the enabling environment. He was addressing the crime but completely avoiding the accusation of shielding the criminals.
And this moment really solidified the national narrative that the state leadership was, for lack of a better term, drowning in the scandal.
Yeah.
But the political performance is now secondary to the immense weight of the federal judiciary.
And that's the good news for the taxpayer here.
It is. This is now a full-blown, multi-agency federal investigation, and it's being treated as the largest welfare fraud case in U.S. history.
So what are the concrete results of this federal intervention so far? What's happening on the ground?
The investigation is proceeding rapidly. Federal prosecutors have already charged 78 defendants related to the various fraud schemes, and they have been very clear that more indictments are expected. The federal effort is laser-focused on following those international money laundering trails and recovering the missing millions.
And critically, the federal assessment seems to provide an independent validation of the whistleblowers' claims regarding that systemic failure.
Absolutely. DOJ officials reportedly described Minnesota as a case study in systemic failure, confirming that the fraud thrived because the state's oversight collapsed. This confirms that the root cause was the environment fostered by the state, not simply external criminal opportunism. The federal government is essentially endorsing the whistleblowers' diagnosis of structural dereliction.
So, if the federal judiciary is prosecuting the crime, what is the full machinery of the federal government doing in response to those international and security concerns we discussed earlier?
This is where the national security response really comes into play, and it requires coordinated actions far beyond just the Department of Justice. The Treasury Department, specifically their Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, is pulling all the Hawala transfer flags from the last 5 years.
Wow.
They're attempting to map the entire scope of these informal financial networks that were used to move bulk cash overseas. This is a massive effort aimed at closing that national security blind spot that Minnesota allegedly opened.
And what about the FBI and Homeland Security? What are their roles?
The Department of Homeland Security is mapping the precise international money trails and looking at asset forfeiture overseas, so trying to claw back some of this money. Meanwhile, the FBI is undertaking the critical task of reviewing whether Minnesota's fraud networks intersected with known foreign criminal or extremist operations.
So they're trying to connect the dots.
They're trying to connect the financial data from the Hawala transfers to intelligence on groups like Al-Shabaab.
The breadth of this federal response, from the DOJ prosecuting defendants to the Treasury mapping illicit finance corridors, it really just underscores the gravity of the alleged failure.
It does.
It confirms that this is being treated not just as a financial crime, but as a serious breach of financial and possibly national security protocols.
And that context gives serious analytical weight to the conservative media label of Minnesota's Watergate. That analogy persists because it focuses on the alleged cover-up, the documented retaliation against employees, and the alleged abuse of power that allowed the corruption to flourish at the top, rather than just focusing on the original theft. The integrity crisis is what demands this ongoing federal attention.
It seems for years, state leaders may have believed this disaster would remain localized and manageable. But the moment those whistleblowers forced the truth into the public light, they initiated a massive federal intervention focused on systemic failure, international money laundering, and potential terror finance connections. That window for political maneuvering is now closed. The truth is catching up.
Thank you, and thank you to our listeners for joining this deep dive.
That's all for this deep dive, but it leaves us with one haunting question. When a political calculation is allegedly prioritized over the fundamental protection of the public purse, and when state employees are forced to risk everything to expose the very corruption their leadership is accused of shielding, who is left to protect the rules of the game?